Hello, everybody. Apologies for the slight delay in us getting started. We're just letting a couple more people in. And I think we have sufficient numbers. So I'm Jambo, Ola, and Hey from Nairobi, from Cali, and from Copenhagen. Welcome, media colleagues, to this official launch of the 15th edition of UNEP's institutional series, The Emissions Gap Report. This year, aptly subtitled, No More Hot Air, Please. As the title suggests, the report finds that we need massive global mobilization to cut all greenhouse gas emissions starting today. My name is Keisha Rukikaire, Head of News and Media for UNEP, and I will be moderating this short event. We have with us today UNEP's Executive Director, Inge Anderson, who joins us from Cali, Colombia, where she, alongside thousands of other delegates, are working to protect people and planet at the ongoing UN Biodiversity Summit. Also joining us from Denmark is Anne Olof, who is the Chief Scientific Editor of the Emissions Gap Report. Now, before we start, I'll do a little housekeeping. The press conference is being recorded and streamed live on UNEP's YouTube channel. We have 30 minutes for our program today, and we'll start with a couple of short statements, followed by a presentation of the key findings, and then on to questions from the media. We hope to use about half the time for questions. So for media with questions, you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Please submit your questions in writing in this box. And when you do so, please specify your name and the media outlet that you represent. Now, most of you will have already received materials under embargo, so please feel free to start putting your questions in the box immediately. So without further ado, we'll move on to the first part of our program, which is a short video message on the Emissions Gap Report by the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Gutteres.
The message of today's Emissions Gap Report is clear. We are teetering on a planetary tightrope. Either leaders bridge the emissions gap, or we plunge headlong into climate disaster, with the poorest and most vulnerable suffering the most. This report shows annual greenhouse gas emissions at an all-time high, rising 1.3% last year. They must fall 9% each year to 2030, to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoid the very worst of climate change. Current policies are taking us towards a catastrophic 3.1 degrees Celsius temperature rise by the end of the century. As this report rightly puts it, people and planet cannot afford more hot air. The emissions gap is not an abstract notion. There is a direct link between increasing emissions and increasingly frequent and intense climate disasters. Around the world, people are paying a terrible price. Record emissions mean record sea temperatures, supercharging monster hurricanes. Record heat is turning forests into tinder boxes and cities into saunas. Record rains are resulting in biblical floods. Today's report shows affordable existing technologies can achieve the emissions reductions we need to 2030 and 2035 to meet the 1.5 degree limit, but only with a surge in ambition and support. The upcoming United Nations Climate Conference, COP29, must drive progress in two ways. First, COP29 starts the clock for countries to deliver new National Climate Action Plans, or NDCs, by next year. Governments have agreed to align these plans with 1.5 degrees. That means they must drive down all greenhouse gases emissions and cover the whole economy, pushing progress in every sector. And they must win us off our fossil fuel addiction, showing how governments will phase them out fast and fairly, and contributing to global goals to accelerate renewables rollout and halt the reverse deforestation. The largest economies, the G20 members, responsible for around 80% of all emissions, must lead. And I urge first movers to come forward. Second, finance will be front and center at COP29. Developing countries urgently need serious support to accelerate the transition to clean energy and deal with the violent weather they are already facing. COP29 must agree a new finance goal that unlocks the trillions of dollars they need, and provides confidence it will be delivered. We know the price of climate inaction is far greater. This would require a significant increase in concessional public finance that can be complemented by innovative sources such as fossil fuel extraction levies. The The COP29 outcome must also send clear signals to drive action on debt relief and reform of the multilateral development banks to make them bigger and bolder. Today's emissions gap report is clear. We are playing with fire, but there can be no more playing for time. We are out of time. Closing the emissions gap means closing the ambition gap, the implementation gap, and the finance gap, starting at COP29. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now hand the floor to Ms. Anderson for her reflections on the findings of the report. Thank you.
Good morning from Cali, Colombia, and forgive me if the connection might be a little shaky. But good morning to members of the press. As we've just heard from the Secretary General, some parts of the world are burning and some parts are drowning, and people everywhere are struggling to cope and in many cases to survive, particularly and always the poorest and the most vulnerable. And it's against this backdrop of tragedy and rising climate anxiety that new climate pledges are due for submission by February of next year. This, the 2024 edition of UNEP's emissions gap report, tells us that nations must show a massive increase in the new national determined contributions, these promises that we make to each other and to the world and our planet every 5 years. And those NDCs have to be accompanied by rapid delivery, or the Paris Agreement goal of holding global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2100 will be dead within a few years, and the target of well below 2 degrees will take its place in the intensive care unit. As things stand, the current NDCs put the world on track for a global temperature rise of 2.6 to 2.8 degrees this century. And even worse, policies currently in place are insufficient to meet even these NDCs. If nothing changes and we continue as we are, we're heading for a temperature rise of around 3.1 degrees by 2100. The consequences for people, societies, and economies of such extreme warnings are frankly unthinkable. And as we are in Cali, Colombia, for the biodiversity COP16, we must remember that it would be impossible to meet the goals of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework when raging wildfires, ruinous storms, and creeping desertification and land degradation are devastating species, ecosystems, and habitats. So, climate crunch time is here. The new NDCs and their implementation must collectively cut 42% off greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to get on a least cost pathway for 1.5 degrees. Looking out to 2035, emissions must fall by 57%. In annual terms, we need to shave 7.5% off of emissions every year until 2035, a figure that if we procrastinate, that figure will obviously grow with every year of inaction. Now, this is a gargantuan task that requires global mobilization on a scale and a pace never seen before. But it does, for the moment at least, remain technically possible. Nations can deliver the cuts needed by investing heavily in solar and wind energy, in forests, in reforming buildings, transport and industry sectors, and more, all backed by a whole of government approach, a new financial global architecture, and strong private sector action. The G20, particularly the members that dominate emissions and with a long trail, need to do the heavy lifting. But all G20s, when they move together, can actually step up and step in to be part of that very solution. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is one of the greatest asks of the modern era. We may not make it, but the only certain path to failure is not trying. And let's remember this: we are operating on a sliding scale of disruption. Because after all, 1.5 is better than 1.6, 1.6 is better than 1.7, and so on. In fact, as we know, every fraction of a degree matters in terms of lives saved, economies protected, damages avoided, biodiversity conserved, and the ability to rapidly bring down any temperature overshoot. So I urge everyone, No more hot air, please. Use COP29 next month to increase action now to set the stage for dramatically stronger NDCs that target the 1.5 degrees and then go all out to deliver the necessary emissions cut by 2030 and by 2035 and beyond until we reach the net zero and that is achieved by 2050. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson. We'll now hear the key findings. We'll get a presentation of the key findings from Anne Olof, who is the Chief Scientific Editor of the EGR. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Keisha. And I hope you can see my slides very shortly. So again, this year, we're launching the emissions gap report ahead of the annual climate change negotiations, the so-called COP meetings, to provide an independent science-based assessment of key aspects that will be central to the international discussions. And these include, and now I need to check my slide. So these include the updating the annual assessments of trends in global greenhouse gas emissions. We look at global and G20 progress towards 2030 targets and also towards net zero emissions pledges. We estimate and update the emissions gap for 2030 and 35, and we look at global warming implications. And as we already heard this year, what's special is that countries are right now preparing their next NDCs. And if sufficiently ambitious, these could bridge the emissions gap in 2035. So we have a special focus in this year's report on what we need from these NDCs. We look into how we can possibly translate global milestones and targets into national action and ambition needed in the next NDCs. We look at sectoral opportunities for reducing and accelerating emissions reductions, and we look at the implications for mitigation finance and investment. But if we start by looking at global greenhouse gas emissions, these grew by 1.3% from 2022 to 2023 to reach a new record of 57.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. This growth rate was above the average annual rate of the decade preceding the COVID-19 pandemic. And we also see that emissions grew all across sectors apart from land use change, and forestry. While we have seen progress in terms of increased deployment of renewable energy and electrification, it's not yet happening fast enough to significantly displace fossil fuels, and these still account for approximately 68% of current greenhouse gas emissions. Furthermore, if we look at action and ambition, nothing much has happened at the global level since last year's report. And also, if we zoom in on the G20 members who account for about 77% of global emissions, we see that these are not yet on track to deliver on the globally insufficient NDCs for 2030. We see that out of the G20 members, only 6 are on track to achieving their current NDC targets for 2030 based on existing policies, whereas 11 members would need further action, further policies, and strengthening of policies to get on track to meeting their 2030 targets. We have not included the African Union in this assessment, as the African Union does not have a collective NDC target. All in all, this means that collectively the G20 implementation gap for 2030 is about 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalents annually, and this is for the unconditional NDCs. And globally, the implementation gap is about 2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent annually for the unconditional NDCs and about 5 gigatons for the conditional NDCs. This is about the same size as the gap, this implementation gap last year. So no progress there. And altogether, this also means that the emissions gap remains large and unchanged from last year. If we look at 2030, you can see the gap between where the conditional and unconditional NDCs would take us, the orange and the red lines in the figure, and where we need to be according to science, represented by the blue and the green lines in the figure. Of course, we can't yet say what the actual emissions gap will be in 2035. We need all countries to submit their NDCs before we can do so. But if we assume that the current level of effort implied by the current NDCs is continued, this emissions gap will grow further into the 2030s. What we see is that the current unconditional and conditional NDCs reduce emissions by 4 and 10% respectively relative to 2019 levels, whereas what we need is a 28 and 42% reduction by 2030 and a 37 to 57% reduction by 2035. And of course, this huge emissions gap also comes with consequences for temperature projections. Based on existing policies and assuming that these will continue after 2030, we are looking at limiting global warming to 3.1 degrees Celsius with a 66% chance over the course of this century. The implementation or full implementation of unconditional and conditional NDCs reduces its projection slightly to 2.6 and 2.8 degrees. But it's only if we look at the most optimistic scenario that we consider, which basically assumes that all the most stringent pledges countries have currently put on the table, so that's the conditional NDCs and all net zero pledges are fully implemented, that we get closer to the goal of the Paris Agreement. This slide also shows you that immediate action is critical. It's critical for temperature projections. There's a 0.5 degree difference between existing policies, the continuation of those, and the current conditional NDC scenario. And this becomes even more apparent if we look at our chance to actually limit global warming to the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. So as you see from this figure, based on current policies and based on current NDC pledges, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is virtually impossible. And as equally important, it will be extremely difficult to limit global warming to below 2 degrees. So basically what the report says is that we need to reach emission levels in 2030 that are below the ones associated with the current pledges. So we know what the global challenge is, and the COPs and the Paris Agreement sets the framework and the requirements for the next NDCs. These should, for instance, and notably, represent progress beyond the previous ones, but they should also explain how they represent the highest possible ambition, and they should also explain and respond to the calls of the first global stocktake in terms of being 1.5% degree aligned, and responding to some of the sectoral targets, including the tripling of renewable energy deployment, the doubling of the annual energy efficiency rates, and also the transition away from fossil fuels. Of course, it's really difficult, and there's no single and no simple answer to how we can translate these global requirements into national level. But what we can do is we can be informed by global approaches that can tell us something about what would be consistent ranges with 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. And we look at the G20 collectively in the report to do so. And what the report shows is that no matter whether we look at fair share ranges or cost-effective ranges, the G20 NDC target is not aligned with neither of these. Of course, these ranges look very different for individual countries, and some G20 members would have to reduce emissions faster than others. And what's important is that no matter what, stronger international cooperation and support, including climate finance, is absolutely essential. We also look at how this can be brought about in practice, and we provide an updated assessment of sectoral mitigation potentials of 2035, which enables us to answer, at least technically or theoretically, is it possible to still bridge the emissions gap? And what the assessment shows is that the total potential available is actually almost double or around double of what would be required to align with 2-degree pathways, and about 30% above what is required for 1.5-degree pathways. And this is both for 2030 and for 2035. Furthermore, options, especially in wind, solar, PV, and forestry alone, account for about half of the potential. And there are other important measures, including demand side and efficiency measures, and electrification and fuel switching across sectors, including buildings, industry sectors. How can we bring this about? We need to realize these potential means that we need to overcome persisting challenges. We need to massively boost policies, support, and not least finance and investment. It is assessed that at least a 6-fold increase in investment would be required to get on a 1.5-degree pathway. However, not all of this will be incremental. In fact, only about 0.9 to 2.1 trillion US dollars would be needed would be incremental, which should be manageable within the size of the overall global economy. As the figure shows, there are large differences between funding needs and flows across sectors and equally so across geographies. A shift in investment patterns whereby international funding will be directed towards emerging market and developing economies outside of China would be essential to bring on the green transition. This also presents an opportunity for these economies to detail the means of implementation they would be needing to achieve ambitious targets for 2035. So the report includes a checklist for the next NDCs that we hope countries will find useful. I will not go through it. I will just say that more than anything, this year's report shows that we need a quantum leap in ambition in the next NDCs, but it also shows that ambition means nothing without action, and that action needs to start today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to try and rush through about 3-4 questions. I will start with one. This is for me, Economic India. Will ask, there is unequivocal about the country's climate action in their NDCs, but before that, countries will meet in Baku, where finance, the big enabler of climate action, will need to be agreed on. What is your message to parties in light of the findings of the emissions gap report?
The message is, as countries are meeting at the annual meetings and have meetings in Washington, IMF and World Bank, is to really step up the reforming of the financial system. We are delighted to see that, as Ajay Banga, the president of the World Bank, speaks to, that he wants to sweat the capital and make the both concessional and non-concessional capital work harder, both for private and public sector, so that each dollar invested will deliver greater investments. Also, the targets that they have set for investments in clean and green climate investments is very, very significant. Everyone needs to understand, and that's, of course, only public money. We also need to see private sector money flow. And here I want to emphasize that with the net zero alliances and scope 1, 2, and 3 commitments that a number of private sector banks have made under the UNEP FI initiative, financial initiative, we are seeing slowly but surely investments portfolio move into a more climate friendly future. However, we need to see this much, much faster. And of course, the poorest countries have a difficulty and the inequity in raising finance on the global markets. Their risk profile is seen as higher, quote unquote. But the conversation is that if we do not find ways of changing some of those incentives in terms of risk profile by buying down the cost of risk with public money, then we will not see the kind of flows that need to be flowing to the developing countries so that they can justly and fairly make the investments that they need. Look, I live in Africa, and we have many countries on the continent where we do not yet have 100% access to modern electricity. And these countries, some of them, sit with hydrocarbons under their feet. And what they need to see is climate finance coming in so that they do not need to necessarily make those investments that lock in for longer term, but so that rather they can find justice in this transformation. So it is an all-out reform at the public and private sector to step up financing. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a linked question from Seth Borenstein at AP. I think this might be one for either of you. How crucial is climate finance to limiting warming to 1.5 or 2? Is there a good estimate for how much warming full or near full climate finance can avoid?
Maybe I'll start and Anne can come in. Just to say that we understand that we need to see a 6-fold increase in the financing, and that would take us to from the current level of 6.7 trillion to about 11.7 trillion by 2035. And while these numbers may sound very large, let's just put it in a degree of perspective, because that is only a small fraction of the estimated already going in investments into infrastructure. And so it's actually very limited. It's about 0.9 trillion additional to 2.1 trillion additional to what is already going into infrastructure. So let's be very smart about the money that we are investing today and make sure that that money doesn't invest in yesterday's technologies and yesterday's infrastructure, but in that of tomorrow. And let's also recognize that when we need money for other things, including conflict, we seem to find it. Well, this is probably the largest conflict of all, our battle with climate change. I speak to you from Colombia, where the tagline to this COP is making peace with nature. Well, we do need to make peace with climate. And yes, that will take investments. But Anne, you can take it from here.
I think you answered it very eloquently already, Inge. I would just add that, of course, these investments don't even take all the benefits into account and the avoided damages and so forth. So I actually think it would be very costly not to invest in a green transition, and also that this is actually not just investing in climate change mitigation, it's investing in realizing development objectives and goals of developing economies. Thank you.
Thank you both. One final question before we wrap up, which was asked by two people. One is Megan Rowling from Climate Home News, and the other is MD Borhanul Ashikin from Bangladesh. Says, what does this report tell us about how G20 countries need to change the way they are implementing their NDCs in order to get on track to meet their commitments in 2030? And how much is the lack of a plan for global just transition holding back progress on cutting emissions?
So what the report speaks to is that the totality of emissions that go into our atmosphere needs to be reduced. The report also obviously recognized that there are those who have the better ability to do so, but the report states that all of the G20 countries need and must make those efforts to reduce. When we look at the totality of what the G20 is responsible for in terms of emissions, it's well over 70%. And clearly those 70% needs to be reduced dramatically. So every G20 country, irrespective of where it stands on the long historical trail, has an opportunity to lean in to this investment opportunity and change its emissions structure. Now, it is correct, of course, that there are countries that have greater affordability, that are not on the development path. And that is why the Secretary General has been very open in calling for OECD countries to try to stretch and do even more so as to leave space for those that may have a harder time making the 2050 net zero. But Anne, you could pick it up from here, please.
Thank you. Yeah, and in addition to that, most of these G20 countries, apart from one G20 member, have made net zero emission pledges late in the century. And these are pledges made by countries themselves, but realizing them requires a lot of time and effort, or time is at least running out. And especially for countries that have not yet peaked emissions, it will be important to peak as soon as possible and then reduce emissions very rapidly following the peak to be able to achieve the net zero emission pledges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it is about that time we need to wrap up. Thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us and your kind attention. Thank you to our expert panel. We remain available should you have questions. Have a good evening, have a good morning, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keisha.